Let's get right into it. Late Thursday into Friday, U.S. Central Command confirmed a sixth consecutive night of strikes against Iran. And among the targets this time were two bridges near Bandar Abbas, the port city that's become ground zero for this entire fight over the Strait of Hormuz. This isn't a new war. It's the reignition of one that most of the world thought had already ended. Here's the timeline you need to have straight before anything else makes sense. The war itself started February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel carried out a joint opening strike on Iran that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and triggered a massive retaliatory barrage of missiles and drones across the region. That was the opening chapter. What followed was roughly 6 weeks of open combat until a ceasefire and a memorandum of understanding brought things to a fragile halt. That ceasefire held, on paper, for a few months, but it was never fully stable. Iran continued asserting control over parts of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway between Iran and Oman that a huge share of the world's oil and gas physically has to pass through every single day. Iran began firing on commercial vessels transiting the strait, trying to force shipping companies to follow routes and rules that Tehran, not international maritime law, would control. That escalated through early July. On July 6th and 7th, 3 ships came under attack in the strait. President Trump, appearing at the NATO summit that week, said he now considered the ceasefire agreement over. Not paused, over. He said he'd allow diplomatic talks to keep going in parallel, but he made clear he thought the negotiators were, in his words, wasting their time. It's worth understanding how we got to that ceasefire in the first place, because the path there was never smooth either. Back in April, Pakistan introduced a draft proposal for a 45-day, 2-phased ceasefire framework, which Iran actually rejected, countering instead with its own 10-point peace plan. Despite that initial rejection, President Trump extended a version of the ceasefire indefinitely later that same month. Through March, Trump had repeatedly declared the conflict essentially finished, at one point saying the war was, in his words, very complete, and claiming Iran's military had been destroyed and the strait reopened, even though independent reporting at the time indicated Iranian missile strikes were continuing. In the strait had not, in fact, fully reopened to normal traffic. That pattern, declarations of victory followed by continued fighting, has been a recurring feature of how this war has been communicated publicly, and it's part of why so much caution is warranted around any single claim that the conflict is over, including the ceasefire that just collapsed again this month. From there, it moved fast. By July 10th and 11th, U.S. Central Command had already launched multiple rounds of strikes. One report put a single wave at roughly 140 targets in a single night, hitting Iranian missile and drone sites, naval assets, ammunition storage, communications infrastructure, and coastal surveillance positions. Iran responded by targeting U.S.-linked sites in Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait. Neither side backed down, and that back and forth has now stretched into this 6th consecutive night of strikes. So let's talk about last night specifically, because this is the news right in front of us. U.S. Central Command says the latest wave of strikes began around 9:30 p.m. Iran time, which lines up to about 2 p.m. Eastern. CENTCOM's public statement described the goal in blunt terms: to further degrade Iranian military capabilities. That phrase has been repeated almost verbatim every single night this week, and it matters, because it tells you the strategy isn't a single knockout operation. It's sustained, repeated pressure, night after night, hitting whatever Iran has managed to rebuild or reposition since the last round. Explosions were reported in Bandar Abbas, the southern Iranian port city that sits almost directly on the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian state television reported loud blasts in the area. And this is the part that's driving today's headline: strikes hit a bridge connecting Bandar Abbas to Shiraz, Iran's 5th most populous city. According to Iranian state media, the bridge strike killed 2 people and wounded 4 others. A second location just west of Bandar Abbas also reportedly took bridge damage in the same wave. Beyond the bridges, Iranian state media reported explosions across a wide spread of the country overnight, not just the usual coastal targets. Reports named strikes or explosions near Qashm Island in the Strait, the port city of Bushehr, an industrial hub outside Avaz in Khuzestan province, Iran Shar, near the border with Pakistan, and in Hamadan County in the country's southwest. That geographic spread is worth sitting with for a second, because it's wider than what we were seeing in the opening nights of this new round of strikes. The campaign that started along the coast has been pushing steadily further inland. Now, why bridges? This is the part that connects directly to something President Trump said publicly just 2 days earlier. In a Tuesday evening interview, Trump laid out what was coming if Iran didn't return to serious negotiations. His words, as widely reported: next week comes the power plants. Next week comes the B. Ridges. We're going to knock out their infrastructure unless they get to the table. That was Tuesday. By Thursday night, the bridges were already hit. Not next week. This week. Whether that's a deliberate acceleration to keep Iran off balance, or simply a difference between public rhetoric and operational timing, is something we don't have a confirmed answer to. But the sequence itself is not in dispute. Iran's response to that threat, delivered through a spokesperson for its top military command on Telegram, was about as unambiguous as it gets. The statement warned that if the U.S. followed through on hitting infrastructure, everything still standing in the region would be, and this is close to their own language, crushed under the force of Iran's armed forces, so thoroughly that no trace of it would remain. That's not a subtle threat. It's a direct promise of large-scale retaliation against regional infrastructure if the bridge and power plant campaign continues. And Iran has been explicit that the Strait of Hormuz itself is the one line it says it will not allow to be crossed. Iranian military spokespeople have repeatedly used the phrase invincible red line to describe the strait, stating flatly that Iran will not permit the United States, which they describe as a foreign, extra-regional power, to interfere with it. That framing, the strait as sovereign, non-negotiable territory in Iran's eyes, is the single biggest reason this conflict hasn't been resolved through diplomacy yet, because it's fundamentally incompatible with the American and international position that the strait is international waters that must remain open to all shipping. Let's talk about the blockade, because that's the other major piece of this alongside the airstrikes. Earlier this week, the U.S. Navy reimposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports, and just recently disabled a vessel attempting to breach it, reportedly an oil tanker headed toward Karg Island, which is one of Iran's most important oil export terminals and functions as a genuine economic lifeline for the country. This is significant because it marks an escalation beyond just airstrikes into a broader campaign of economic pressure through naval enforcement. Ships attempting to move Iranian oil are now facing direct interdiction, not just the threat of it. The knock-on effect on global shipping has been dramatic. Before this war restarted, an average of roughly 110 ships transited the Strait of Hormuz on a daily basis. A staggering volume, given that somewhere around a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade and roughly a fifth of global liquefied natural gas shipments pass through that single choke point. In the most recent 24-hour period reported, that number had collapsed to just 3 ships. 3 compared to a baseline of 110. That's not a slowdown. That's functionally a shutdown of normal commercial traffic through one of the most important waterways on the planet. On top of that, there have been persistent reports of GPS spoofing in the region, a form of electronic interference that makes ships' navigation systems broadcast false positions, sometimes throwing a vessel's reported location off by dozens of miles. That's been an ongoing problem for months now, and it makes it considerably harder for anyone, including neutral observers, to monitor exactly what's moving through the strait and where. The naval blockade itself has gone through phases rather than running continuously since the war began. An earlier version of the blockade ran from mid-April through late May before being lifted, and there was even a brief pause in the broader strait campaign back in early May, referred to at the time by military planners as a TE, temporary operational halt. What we're seeing now is a reimposed version of that blockade, layered on top of the resumed airstrike campaign, which suggests the current phase of the conflict is combining both military and economic pressure simultaneously, rather than relying on strikes alone the way earlier phases sometimes did. There's also been formation of what's been described as a Persian Gulf Strait Authority, an apparent attempt at some kind of coordinating body among regional and international stakeholders to manage the crisis around the strait itself, separate from the direct U.S.-Iran negotiating channel. How much actual operational authority that body has versus functioning as a diplomatic forum isn't entirely clear from public reporting so far. But its existence reflects just how internationalized the stakes around this single waterway have become, given how much of the global economy depends on oil and gas continuing to move through it. Oil markets have felt this, though maybe less dramatically than you'd expect given the scale of disruption. Brent crude was trading in the low to mid-80s per barrel range as of the most recent reporting, with West Texas Intermediate a few dollars behind that. Analysts covering the situation have described a kind of creeping fatigue in the markets, a sense that after months of this conflict, traders and corporate treasury teams have grown somewhat numb to headlines that would have caused much bigger price swings earlier in the year. That doesn't mean the risk has gone away. Multiple commodity analysts, HIA specifically warned that businesses treating the current range-bound prices as a sign of stability are overlooking sharp, sudden volatility spikes that keep happening underneath the surface, and that companies with real exposure are increasingly extending their hedging positions rather than relaxing them. Now let's turn to Iran's retaliation pattern, because this is not a one-directional campaign. Iran has been hitting back nightly, primarily against U.S. military infrastructure and personnel across Gulf allies, rather than against the American homeland directly. Kuwait's defense ministry confirmed that waves of Iranian drones caused material damage there, targeting what officials described as several vital facilities. Interception operations caused debris to fall in residential areas, resulting in property damage, though officials ID there were no casualties from that particular incident. Kuwait separately reported intercepting over 30 hostile drones in its airspace in a single day. Similar retaliatory strikes have hit sites in Bahrain and Jordan over the preceding days. The weapon Iran keeps reaching for is the same one it's relied on throughout this entire war: Shahed-type kamikaze drones, relatively cheap, one-way attack drones that don't need to survive the mission, just reach the target. Iran has used them extensively against shipping, against military installations, and reportedly maintains large stockpiles capable of sustaining this kind of tempo for an extended period. Now, and this is important for accuracy, you'll hear some specific and dramatic claims circulating about Iranian-allied drone stockpiles positioned outside the immediate region, including claims about a large number of drones staged in Cuba capable of reaching the U.S. mainland. We want to be straight with you. Those specific claims are not something we have found, corroborated by on-the-record government statements or named verifiable reporting. They circulate widely in commentary and warning-style content around this conflict, but a claim of that scale and specificity deserves a named source before it gets repeated as settled fact. And as of this broadcast, we don't have one. We're flagging that explicitly rather than passing it along uncritically. What is well documented is the broader concern from U.S. officials about drone swarm attacks as an emerging threat category generally. The concept that current air defense systems are built to intercept smaller numbers of inbound threats, and a sufficiently large simultaneous drone swarm could overwhelm those defenses, even if a majority of all drones are successfully shot down. That's a real and openly discussed vulnerability in modern air defense doctrine. Whether it applies specifically and imminently to this conflict versus being a general strategic concern is a distinction worth keeping in your head. Let's talk about where the diplomacy actually stands, because this war has had genuine, real negotiation attempts running alongside the fighting the entire time. And it's easy to lose track of that amid the strike reports. Pakistan has served as one of the primary mediators throughout, with Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif directly engaged in trying to manage de-escalation. Oman has also played a central role, given its geographic position directly across T. He's straight from Iran. Omani officials reportedly drafted a proposal for managing shipping traffic through the strait using two separately controlled routes, an attempt at a face-saving compromise that would let both the U.S. and Iran claim they hadn't backed down on their core position. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has remained the central figure on Iran's diplomatic side, holding direct talks with Saudi, Turkish, Omani, and Pakistani counterparts throughout July. And Iran's negotiating team has been explicit that they remain deeply distrustful of the American side. Iran's chief negotiator has publicly stated they told the American delegation directly that Iran has no trust in Washington, while simultaneously saying Iran remains prepared for what they call all-out defense if the ceasefire framework is broken by the American side. There was, before this news cycle, actually a period where a broader final deal looked close. Reporting indicated a draft text covering the reopening of the strait, a phased lifting of sanctions on Iran, and the release of frozen Iranian assets. But Araghchi has publicly said that Iran will not accept a return to the pre-conflict status quo on the strait. Iran, in his framing, intends to maintain a form of shared sovereignty over it alongside Oman, which is fundamentally at odds with the American and international shipping industry's position that the strait must simply return to being open, unrestricted international waters. Sitting alongside the strait dispute is the nuclear question, which has been the other core justification for this entire war from the American and Israeli side since February. U.S. officials have repeatedly said that preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon remains a non-negotiable red line, tracing back to the opening strikes in late February that targeted Iran's nuclear program directly. There have been specific references during this conflict to one nuclear-linked facility built into a mountain, a site associated with centrifuge assembly and reportedly still under construction, that officials have said wasn't targeted in earlier rounds of strikes specifically because construction there hadn't progressed far enough to justify it. It's been publicly flagged as a site that could be targeted going forward if that changes. The administration's public position throughout has been that Iran previously committed not to pursue weapons-grade enrichment as part of earlier negotiations, and that continued enrichment activity near weapons-grade levels is what makes this red line non-negotiable, regardless of how the strait dispute itself gets resolved. The White House, for its part, has said Iran has expressed continued willingness to talk even while these nightly strikes continue. Whether that's a genuine diplomatic opening or largely rhetorical, given that talks and strikes have now been running in parallel for over a week without a breakthrough, is very much an open question. There's been at least one concrete goodwill gesture worth noting. Iran released an American woman who had been detained since December 2024, which the administration publicly credited as a sign of good faith from Tehran. So here's the honest state of play on diplomacy. There is a real channel, real mediators, and a real draft framework that exists on paper. But the single hardest sticking point, control of the Strait of Hormuz, is the same issue that broke the ceasefire in the first place, and neither side has shown any public sign of shifting its position on it. Now, a word on casualties, because the numbers being reported from different sides diverge, and it's worth being precise about who's saying what. Iranian government sources, including the country's health ministry and government spokesperson Fatemeh Mohajerani, have put the number of people injured across the recent wave of strikes above 260, including women and children, with more than 30 civilians reported killed. Independent outlets covering the conflict, including CNN, have been explicit that they cannot independently verify those figures, not because they're necessarily false, but because independent, on-the-ground verification inside Iran during active hostilities is extremely difficult. That caveat matters. It doesn't mean dismiss the numbers. It means hold them with appropriate uncertainty until independently confirmed, the same way we treat casualty figures from any government during an active war, regardless of which government it is. On the American and Allied side, official reporting has focused primarily on military and infrastructure damage rather than personnel losses, with no confirmed U.S. military casualties reported in connection with this latest round of strikes as of this broadcast. It's also worth putting a running tally on the broader toll this conflict has taken since it began in February, since the last week of strikes is one chapter in a much longer and heavier conflict. Independent trackers following the war have documented thousands of deaths in Iran and Lebanon combined since the opening strikes, dozens of deaths across Israel and Gulf Arab states, and displacement affecting millions of people across the region, including, notably, more than a sixth of Lebanon's entire population, at points when the related Israel-Hezbollah front flared back up alongside the main conflict. On the maritime side, specific alley, the broader crisis around the strait has produced its own separate toll. At least one tugboat sunk, more than a dozen merchant ships damaged with several abandoned outright, at least 2 merchant vessels captured, and more than a dozen seafarers killed or reported missing, along with casualties among port workers in Bahrain from related strikes. Those are the cumulative costs of a conflict that's now been running, with interruptions, for close to 5 months. Let's talk about the bigger strategic picture, because a few serious foreign policy analysts have weighed in publicly on where this actually goes, and it's worth hearing that out rather than just tracking the nightly strike count. One point of analysis that's gotten attention, the view that American strikes can be tactically effective, destroying specific drones, missile launch sites, and equipment as they're identified, while remaining strategically limited as long as Iran retains the industrial capacity to keep producing or stockpiling replacement weapons. In other words, you can win the individual battle over a launch site and still not be closer to actually ending the war if the other side can simply rebuild. There's also been specific commentary connecting a since-abandoned proposal. Reportedly, a plan to impose something like a 20% fee on shipping transiting the strait, which Trump floated and then walked back, to a broader read that the administration is aware of how much this war is costing in terms of public and economic patience. Analysts reading that walkback have suggested it reflects real awareness inside the administration that the current pace of military and logistics spending isn't something the U.S. can sustain indefinitely without more serious authorization or political cost, and that there are real practical limits well before any future election cycle. The most serious version of the "what would actual victory look like" question has been put directly by foreign policy academics tracking this conflict. Some argue that as long as Iran's Revolutionary Guard leadership structure survives intact, no matter how much physical infrastructure gets destroyed, Tehran can still credibly claim it has endured and therefore prevailed. Under T, at reading, only the removal of the Revolutionary Guard as a governing structure would constitute a decisive outcome. And multiple analysts have been explicit that achieving that through a ground operation is considered well beyond the current combined capacity of standing U.S. ground forces without a dramatically larger and more costly commitment than has been authorized so far. That's the honest tension sitting underneath this entire war. The airstrike campaign can continue degrading Iranian capability night after night, indefinitely, in the way we've now seen for 6 consecutive nights. But degrading capability and achieving a defined political end state are two very different things. And right now, nobody in this conflict, American officials, Iranian officials, or the outside analysts tracking it, has offered a fully convincing answer for what actually ends this. There's also a domestic political dimension worth including, since it's shaping how much runway this campaign actually has. Congressional Democrats have pushed back on the administration's handling of the war, including blocking a major defense funding package in protest over how the conflict has been run and disclosed. There have also been specific complaints from members of Congress across party lines about being kept out of the loop on operational details, with the administration's stated rationale being that operational secrecy is necessary to prevent leaks that could tip off Iran ahead of planned strikes. Whether that's a legitimate operational security concern or an erosion of congressional oversight is, again, a real and unresolved argument, not a settled one. Regionally, this war has also reignited a related front. Fighting between Israel and Hezbollah resumed as part of the broader collapse of the ceasefire framework, adding another dimension to an already sprawling regional conflict that now touches Lebanon, the Gulf states, and the maritime shipping lanes simultaneously. So where does this actually go from here? A few concrete things worth watching over the coming days. First, watch whether the bridge and infrastructure strikes continue and expand, since that was explicitly previewed by President Trump as an escalation track tied directly to whether negotiations resume. If strikes on power plants specifically begin, that would represent a further step up the escalation ladder beyond what we've seen so far. Second, watch Iran's retaliation pattern for any sign of a shift in targeting. So far, Iranian retaliation has been concentrated on regional U.S. military infrastructure and Gulf allies, rather than any direct action against the American homeland. Any change in that targeting pattern would represent a major shift in the nature of this conflict. Third, watch the diplomatic track through Oman and Pakistan specifically. The proposed dual route framework for managing traffic through the strait is the most concrete compromise proposal currently on the table, and whether either side moves toward accepting some version of it is probably the single best real-time indicator of whether this is heading toward a genuine de-escalation or a longer grinding standoff. Fourth, watch the oil markets and shipping data. The collapse from around 110 daily transits through the strait down to just a handful is already a major disruption to global energy flows, and any further tightening of the blockade or further attacks on tankers would be likely to show up quickly in fuel prices well beyond the region. And fifth, watch Congress. The blocked defense funding package and the friction over operational transparency both suggest that domestic political support for an open-ended campaign is not unlimited, and how that plays out could shape the operational tempo just as much as anything happening on the ground in Iran. To be clear about sourcing here, since this is a fast-moving story with a lot of competing claims circulating, the core details in this script, the sixth night strike count, the bridge strikes near Bandar Abbas, the blockade, the shipping collapse in the strait, and the diplomatic timeline, are drawn from CENTCOM's own public statements and corroborated by Geopolitics, CNN, CBS News, NPR, and Al Jazeera's on-the-ground and wire reporting. Casualty figures attributed to Iranian government sources are labeled as such because independent outlets have explicitly said they can't verify them directly. And the claims we specifically flagged as UN verified, the wider drone stockpile claims beyond what's been officially documented, are being called out precisely because they don't meet that same bar, and passing them along without that distinction would be doing you a disservice. That's where things stand tonight. A war that many assumed had ended in June is now in its sixth consecutive night of active combat, with infrastructure strikes now confirmed alongside the military targeting that's defined this campaign since it restarted. A naval blockade, squeezing an already devastated shipping lane, and a diplomatic track that's real but stuck on the exact same sovereignty question that broke the ceasefire in the first place. We'll keep tracking this as it develops, particularly whether the infrastructure campaign expands to power plants as threatened, and whether the Oman-brokered strait proposal gains any real traction on either side. Stay with us for continued coverage.